My background has been 30 years in the business. Started off in the semiconductor space and got my inspiration to do startups from being part of 3 very successful semiconductor startups, and figured that it's easy to do my own until I started them. So I've done 5 startups, some successful, some not so successful, but the last one, Ankina, was purchased by Juniper, and now we have got what we call as the fabric, which really what I want to talk about a little bit is we are a co-creation company, which we create companies from within the fabric, and then we in the networking software space, and then we spin it out after 6 to 8 months. We create a company at a time, and we work with like-minded entrepreneurs. We truly are co-creators. We have engineering lab and everything else associated with it.
Thanks. And to your right is Anil Darni, who's Senior Vice President of Studio Operations at GREE. Would you like to give a little bit of your background, Anil?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Welcome, everyone. I've been in the gaming space and the internet consumer space for about 8 years now. Started with High Five, which used to be the 3rd largest social network. I ran product for them. After that, I switched to gaming. Started a mobile gaming company called Storm 8, which now has over 10 million daily active users, one of the largest gaming companies. And split from there and started my 3rd company, which was Funzio, and did that for about 2.5 years and sold it to a Japanese company called GREE. It's been about a year, sold it for about 210 million. So I manage all the studio operations, and I'm the chief operating officer there.
And to Neil's right is Richard Ogawa. So in addition to some serial entrepreneurs, we have probably one of the most important types of advisors to technology companies in the Valley. Richard, you're a founder and owner of your own patent firm. A little of your background?
Yeah, that's correct. So I just want to tell everybody, as a lawyer in Silicon Valley, I feel like I have the best job because I get to work with all the entrepreneurs. I've been a lawyer focusing on patents and IP for about 20 years. Before that, I spent about 8 years in the semiconductor business and probably worked with over about 400 companies, so seen quite a bit. And just to give you an example of, I think a couple years ago, I feel like I should have retired because I was nominated by the White House to meet the president. I had lunch with Tony Blair, and one of my clients won an Emmy, so I got to the Emmy Award. So as an IP lawyer, I never imagined I could do that, but it was because I worked with these great clients and startups that I was able to share in their experiences.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Well, thank you all for being here. So I think the title of this session is around challenges, and actually, I guess, overcoming those challenges to derive value and successful exits. Anil, I'm going to ask all of you what focus means to you in terms of both solving challenges and identifying them, but also in terms of growing successful companies.
Yeah, I think especially when you start with just 5 people, 10 people in a garage, what's really, really important is to do one thing right and to do it better than anyone else. So as I look back at my career, when we started the first gaming company, the biggest thing there was Apple had just launched its platform, the iOS platform, and it was a complete greenfield. So while everyone was focused on Facebook and gaming on Facebook, we realized that there was this opportunity to bring similar type of games, and that's what we ended up doing. And within 4 months of the business, we were doing $1 million a month, and that was our sort of revenue track record. With the second company, when we spun out of Storm 8, one of the things we realized was we were tired of just copying games that were popular on Facebook, and we wanted to do something innovative. So we attacked an existing space, again on mobile, but we attacked it with a differentiated technology and the graphics that we brought to the gaming space. And when we launched, no one had seen those kind of games before on mobile. So I think it's really important when you focus is not only focus in terms of what the market that you're going after, but also doing just one thing and doing it better than anyone else can.
Now, Rajan, you've been involved in founding 6 companies, among advising others. Is that true? Is it always one thing that predominates the success of each of those 6?
Yep, I would absolutely agree that not only it is just one thing, even within that one thing, narrowly focusing in getting that very, what we call as the minimum viable, I call prototype out. It is, you got to have a broad vision, no question about it. But just as a specific example of it is when I did my first successful startup called Virtual Chips, which was in the semiconductor intellectual property space. When I started off, I didn't think of it as a semiconductor intellectual property space. What I said was, I'm going to build a PCI core and get it to the customer hands, and then message it that I'm in the semiconductor IP space. That worked very well. So, but getting that PCI core out there and establishing, within a few months, $5 million of revenue coming out of it, essentially put us into track of success. So the very, very narrow focus.
That makes a lot of sense. Richard, in terms of you maybe departing from some of the product or market focus that Rajan and Anil have talked about, how important early on is a focus on intellectual property, maybe even over the course of your career? Is it more important these days to have that also front and center, or has that always been a pretty persistent need, in your view, for entrepreneurs to have?
Yeah, I think today more than ever, in light of all the, trade secret issues and employment issues, intellectual property when you start a company is very important. And the reality is most entrepreneurs, when they start a company, the intellectual property comes from somewhere, okay? So the person didn't just wake up and learn this stuff. So when we start a company, we actually have to spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out where the IP came from, whether there's any violations in employment agreements. Typically, there's non-compete clauses in some agreements. Luckily, we live in California, so those are invalid. So a lot of times, before we start the company, we have to do what we call a pretty good scrub on the founders to make sure that the IP is clean.
So it sounds like there's certainly a blueprint, if not a recipe for handling IP or thinking through IP. In maybe a more expansive vein, Rajan, are there continuity in terms of the lessons that you've learned in founding 6 successful companies, and what are some of the other common denominators, if you will, other than focus?
The second one, at least in my case, is to find that very smart partner whom I could also trust. I mean, having a working equation, having integrated with a partner, but also, honestly, being smarter than me and working with that. It is, and I would say, the number one reason why I believe that I was being able to create multiple startups is having that one successful, very bright partner with me, which then I could expand on ideas and having it complementary to me. So, for example, I'm much more focused operationally, and I'm much more focused outward on sales, which is my strength, and on the marketing side of things, whereas having the smart technologist with me, who also had a bigger vision, was very good. So I would say that's the case.
Does that resonate with you as well, Anil? You founded or co-founded Storm8. Tell me about your co-founder and what kind of complements you represented to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that sentiment. So it's imperative to have a founding team. So I've been part of large founding teams. Storm8 was about 6 founders. Funzio was 4. But all of us had worked before, and we actually knew our work style. And then, especially the first year of founding the company, it's intense. It is, you're together 24/7, weekends. There's just you basically end up doing nothing else but just work together. So the other thing we did was we actually started focusing on narrow roles. So for example, at Funzio, I focused on the operational side, really trying to scale the business, hiring, recruiting, marketing, business intelligence, data analytics, while we had another founder that completely focused on product. So what games to do, what genres to build, why are we going into game design, so he focused on that. And the other two founders were very technical. Because we were doing mobile gaming, we needed an expert on the client side to build, whether you're building for iOS or Android. And then when you're trying to scale to millions of users, you really need a strong person for the back-end infrastructure. So it was a really interesting experience, at least with Funzio, because for 2.5 years we were all aligned. I think that's really important, is as a founding team, you really should be aligned. There will be conflicts from time to time, but if you're not aligned with your end goals, whether it is being successful, whether it's being successful in terms of a product or a game, or it's success in terms of money, you really should be aligned the same way, otherwise there will be conflict.
Now, I guess when you think of partners that you can choose, and maybe ones that come with things like investment capital, some partners you may not have as much selection or influence in choosing, such as your board and investors. Richard, tell me how you've observed boards to operate, whether with specific respect to intellectual property or more generally as you observe them in governance manners. Do they fit kind of the definition of the right partner that your two colleagues are describing here?
Yeah, with respect to boards, I've seen probably every example. So, there are some boards that are very aligned with the founders. They have very in-depth knowledge in the technical space, and you're able to really leverage the board, their background, and the infrastructure that they bring to really take the company to new heights. And typically the boards that are composed of VC backers and stuff, they're all very concerned of risk, right? IP rights, trade secret rights, employment issues. So there's no end to that kind of stuff. On the flip side, I have also seen boards where the board didn't know that much about the space. They went ahead and funded the company anyway, and sometimes the boards thought they knew more than the entrepreneurs. They would switch out the founders and the presidents. Sometimes there's some battles, lawsuits, a lot of drama, and at the end of the day, those companies aren't successful. There needs to be some sort of alignment, and I don't think any of this will go away. It's just a part of being human, right?
A lot of war stories, I'm sure, when it comes to boards. But let me ask you, Anil, I guess from a governance perspective, the board manages the managers. Is it possible for executives, for founders to manage the board? And what areas do you think that's important to kind of have that assertiveness?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely manageable. It all depends on who you pick. So if you're entrepreneurs and you have the opportunity to select from multiple VCs, I always recommend looking for angels or investors who actually understand your space. But even if they do understand your space, make sure you can develop a rapport on how you absorb their feedback. So for example, at Funzio, we raised money from a couple of investors. One of them was Rick Thompson. He's very well known in the gaming space. He had funded a company called Playdom that sold to Disney for about $500 million plus. And we knew getting in that he would be someone who's very well versed with the ecosystem, understands the challenges. But there was a period of 8 months where we didn't even have a single board meeting. And that's just because he was confident about what we were doing and he didn't need to interfere. So it's really, really important The second piece of advice I would give entrepreneurs is really have a frank conversation. Even when we raised Series A, we raised about $20 million. We literally talked about exits. And we said, if an exit looks at this valuation or this value, will you say yes or no? The second thing, once you check that, okay, this VC is kind of aligned with my interests, and just not the founders, always think about founders and the team. The team is also pretty important. In the Valley, we just tend to talk about founders all the time. So talk about the interests of the company, the team, and the founders. The second stage would be really working with them and try to figure out how they can help you. So what do they bring to the table apart from money? Because money in some ways is cheap, and it's very cheap when you have traction. So you really need to dig in as to how they can actually help you to get to the next level. So those were the things we looked at.
Rajan, I've heard that a lot, which is, seed money, certainly investor money can be somewhat of a commodity. It's really what flavor of money or what differentiators come with that money. What are some of the other kind of dimensions of boards or investors that should come with the capital they provide?
Well, it's kind of self-serving when I say this, because right now I am running a co-creation company where we encourage entrepreneurs to work with us to create companies, because we believe we have expertise in the space and the value that we bring. So
tell us a little bit about Fabric and how that works.
Yeah, so the latest trend, as we have seen in the space, is incubators and accelerators. What we have tried to do is to create something different. It is, we create companies, a company every 6 to 8 months. We come up with a point of view in the networking software space, so we focus largely on the networking space or in the data center space more broadly. And we work on an idea, we find an entrepreneur who shares a similar passion to some of the spaces we are looking at. We develop the idea, we have an engineering team within the Fabric to kickstart an innovation lab, as we call it. We also create IPs which we community share with the companies we create, and we also provide seed capital. We provide, depending on the type of entrepreneur we line up, we fill in the missing pieces. For example, if the entrepreneur is an architect, then I am the acting CEO for a while till we help find the co-founding CEO, if you will. Or if or my partner is the chief strategist for that. So we work intensely, and we are co-founders.
So those are all, I guess, dimensions, whether it's, and I'm speaking very generally, recruiting, actually taking some management role, helping to think strategically in terms of next phases that should come with investors. Richard, how familiar do you think most of the Valley investors are with some of the intricacies around intellectual property and intellectual property protection?
Yeah, actually, I believe the Valley investors are probably the most sophisticated I've seen as far as intellectual property. When I'm dealing with the funds here, whether it's the Sequoias or Kleiners or Coastal Ventures, they have a very rich understanding of California law, trade secrets, patents, and copyrights. A lot of times when we get investors from outside the area, I don't want to disparage any of these other areas. We always like investors from the outside coming in, but it didn't matter. Asia, even down south in Los Angeles or even New York, they didn't fully understand even some of the basic things on due diligence on how to look at the IP in order to fund the company. So the Valley here, I'm happy to say the investors here are very sophisticated and they move very quickly.
I guess that's good to know. Maybe just turning a bit and talking about going beyond the startup or early stage phase and actually scaling, most aspects of a company. Anil, you're involved in all aspects of marketing, even analytics, customer experience. When do things like that become important in the life cycle of a startup or a private company?
Yeah, I think it all depends on your goals. So if you're truly trying to build a world-class company, you need to think through that holistically. You want your customer service to be as good as you think your product is. So that was important to us from day one. We really focused on acquiring talent and making sure that we kept the standards the same and we were able to maintain the culture of the company. So I think that our biggest challenge was how the company was when it was 10 people or 20 people. How can we keep it intact, that same culture and the same standard, and not lose that focus in hiring when we were 50 or when we were 100. We ended up selling at about 125 people. So that was, I think, the biggest challenge as a founder and as a founding team. And some of the things, at least what I learned, is we learned never to compromise on a hire just because we needed somebody right away. So you should really think through that hard. You'll get a lot of pushback. You'll get a lot of pushback even from the investors, even from the board, who just keeps looking at your hiring numbers every month, and they just push you like, okay, it's at 20. We were supposed to get 25 people. Why haven't you been able to hire 5 more? Because you just, all it takes is for one bad person or one bad hire to come in, and that can screw up the entire culture. It can also demotivate the best people in the company. And we looked at hiring from 2 angles. One was not just talent, not just the skill, but also whether they fit in with our culture. That second part turned out to be way more important than just pure raw horsepower of the hire.
Rajan, again, just drawing on your collective experience with the companies you've worked with, are there certain things that you know will just represent difficult scaling milestones, and what are some of those common milestones or points in the road?
Well, the first part of it, which Anil highlighted, is the most difficult part is scaling the company. The initial core team, once you've gone beyond that, once you've gone beyond the 15, 20 people, then to be able to add on, because frankly at that point, the amount of currency you have in terms of equity becomes dramatically lower. And now you're competing with larger companies who are paying a lot, and people are smart. They do the math and they say, okay, what am I getting out of this? And I would say the ability to sell the interesting work that you're doing, all of that becomes very important, but it certainly becomes very challenging. And especially, I would say this is about as good a time in the Valley as any time for engineers. It's brutally hard to get the right type of talent. And if you get the wrong talent, you have a rough time. And one of the hardest things that I've always found, which I've never learned even after doing all these startups, is firing people is so hard. And to get rid of people and the disruptions that go with it, that I would say is one of my hardest challenges. The second part, much more operationally, is when you bring on the sales teams, especially in the enterprise type focus. When you bring on the salesperson and the type of salesperson, you bring salespeople too early, you burn a lot of cash, and you have nothing to show for it. And that itself causes sometimes a death spiral because of the money you've burned through. So that's always the judgment call. When is the product ready enough that it can be sold and scaled dramatically? And that, I would say, is one of the most interesting challenges that I've always faced.
So a real common point around hiring, incentives, and also in some cases firing. Anil, in describing some of your companies, I think it was Funzio, you were generating $1 million a month very rapidly. Does the sales type of issue that Rajan talks about resonate with you?
Yeah, well, with gaming, we are very lucky. It's all virtual goods, so we really didn't. I have not had to go through this experience of building and scaling a sales team, and I can only believe how challenging it is. But for us, it's more around being able to hire engineers. So the tricky part with gaming is you're as good as your last hit. So if you have a hit in hand, you could be making $1 million a day, $2 million a day. But if the game's not a hit, the company can go bust pretty soon. You only get so many chances. So it's really around motivating the employees, and you tend to attract more of the creative people. So you also need to ensure that in terms of the product vision and the strategy of the company that you're laying the groundwork for, people understand why are we building these kind of games. Because at the end of the day, it's a really great feeling when your games are in the top grossing charts on both Android and the App Store. Like just today, I can just pick up the phone. 2 of our games are in the top 10 on the App Store, generating millions of dollars. So that is an amazing feeling. And when I hear my employees talk to their there when they go out for a barbecue, when they go out over the weekend. That's what they show. They just take out the phone, show the app, and say, that's the company I work for. So it's a really, really tremendous feeling when they can get that kind of satisfaction from the product they build.
Great, great. So we founded and funded our company. We've grown its sales and done the right hiring, picked the right board. The offer's on the table. It's time to think about exit and valuation. You've hired a banker from Ernst & Young to represent you. Richard, in terms of just again narrowly on the intellectual property, which is the core of a lot of value here, what are some of the things that should have been done up to that point to actually maximize valuation at that point?
So at the time of exit, typically there is some bankers and then there's lawyers that are hired, and they always ask the same questions. So it's easy for me to answer this question today. So there's this huge list on, due diligence of the employees and the IP rights. So one big issue is freedom to operate. So they just want to make sure that the product that's made isn't under any claims, causes of action, infringement, and there isn't any assertions. Many times when there's an exit or when you're successful, the fortunate and unfortunate part is you've been sued, okay? So one of the things you have to have typically is some sort of an opinion on why your product doesn't infringe or whether the patent's invalid. So there's a whole freedom to operate issues. With that, they just want to make sure also that all the employees, contractors, patents, all the title is held in the name of the company. So that's one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is how well your product is protected with intellectual property rights. And basically what the acquirer does is they're trying to figure out, were you good about filing patents that actually cover your products? Are there patents that are used for future generations of the products? If you have some source code, was it protected? Is it copyrighted? Was the source code derived from a clean source? Is it something that you actually own exclusively, or is it something that you got from the public domain? There's a lot of those types of questions raised. If you have a very good brand, they want to make sure that you actually filed your trademarks, you have that in place. 20 years ago, I think when I started in ICs, the brands weren't that important, okay? People came up with some names, and the trademark thing was important for the entrepreneur, but today, at least in the gaming or web-based, anything consumer-oriented, the brand is huge, right? Domain names, so those things are checked in detail. So that pretty much answers my question.
Great.
I would add one thing.
Go ahead,
which Richard did emphasize is a very silly thing happened, and you keep telling engineers, there's so much open source, be careful when you get that and incorporate that in your product. And I had this one engineer, there's no malintention, accidentally used a piece of open source in an acquisition, and then you do a black duck. You got to inculcate and repeat it to the team. Be careful, don't mix it up.
Yeah, I know that's often a primary question, at least in buyer diligence. Anil, you've exited 2 companies successfully. Tell me about how you thought about the particular time of exit and valuation.
Yeah, so again, what I'm saying is all through the context of the gaming industry. So as I mentioned, the first thing I mentioned was that it is a hit-driven business. So timing is pretty important. And I think that's something that as a founding team you should always keep an eye on. How is the market changing? How is the ecosystem changing? I mean, even if you look at one of the biggest players, Zynga, they couldn't time mobile right. And now they're kind of still stuck in the Facebook world. So things can move and change pretty fast. So you should always be aware of that. The second thing I wanted to ensure was that at any given time, while I would never run an explicit auction, I wanted to make sure there was always bidders. So that means we would constantly get pings from potential acquirers, people who wanted to do partnership, but I wanted to make sure that I could just pick up the phone or email 3 to 4 people that even had the balance sheet to buy us. The last thing is I kind of ran a dual track process, which just means is let's go to the market, because a lot of investors were interested in giving us a Series B. Actually, we got a $350 million valuation right before the acquisition. So it was an investor that just threw us a term sheet. But it's really important to run this dual process to see what the market can value, to see whether you can actually get people to come in and bid for the business. My personal feeling is anything that's over $100 million, if you're trying to exit for anything over $100 million, it just changes the scale. It changes the kind of buyers you can actually attract. So you have to be very careful and ensure that it's actually a serious offer. There can be serious offers on the table. Otherwise, it can completely derail your business, because you can spend 2 to 3 months trying to make it happen, and it can just slow down everything in the company. And you can also get employees who could get potentially pretty frustrated because the word does get around. So I would be careful on all those counts.
Thank you. And Rajan, your last thoughts perhaps on exit and timing and valuation.
Well, I wish I had sold my company in 2000 when I had an offer for $350 million, and I didn't. Knowing when to exit sometimes, and I said, hey, I can build $1 billion company. I already sold a company before. So chutzpah there, not realizing that we were in a frothy market. So coming to me for advice as to when, and I turned down something like that. But it is important from the standpoint there is no one easy answer as to when is the right time to exit. In my last company, when we got an offer for Juniper to acquire us, we decided to exit even though we were in a large market, we were in a growing market. It became important because I looked at it and I said, the telecom companies are our biggest buyers. The sales process into telecom companies take 3-year cycles. And in that scenario, I said it is better to take the offer on the table than try to build it, even though our product was in every Apple store in the world. And it looked extremely promising. But these things are very, very important to understand the dynamics of what it takes to scale the business, and at the end of the scaling of the business, where it stands. So the answer varies, but yeah, it's important.
Well, I want to ask the audience to thank our panelists for their perspectives, some remarkably consistent ones, but all valuable to one. Thank you very much.